I'd like to start off today with a pretty famous story, which is the story of the third king of Israel. He was the son of King David. His name was Solomon. King Solomon was a young boy. King Solomon, Shlomo. He was a young boy when he became king of Israel. David passed away. And God appears to him in a dream, and this is in the Bible. God appears to him in a dream and says, "You can ask for whatever you wish." Now, what would a young boy wish for? What would you wish for if you were granted anything that you could ask for? Instead of asking for wealth or honor or power, King Solomon requested a listening heart, the ability to judge your people, to distinguish between good and evil. Yeah, wisdom. Wisdom to discern. This was his prayer. This was his request. God was so impressed in the dream that God said to him, "Not only will I grant you what you've asked for, but I will also add to you wealth and honor as well." And that is how Solomon became the wisest of all men. When he awoke, he was able to understand the word, the conversations of the birds chirping outside the window. He was able to understand and to comprehend the secrets of the universe. Soon after, very soon after, he travels to Jerusalem to pay tribute to God Almighty. He wants to go to Jerusalem, to the Holy Temple that his father, to the temple. And there he wants to thank God at the Holy of Holies. Well, you know what? I caught myself as I said that, and very good catch. The Holy Temple was actually built by King Solomon, right? Even though it was planned by his father, King David. But you are correct. It was still in Judea and Samaria, right? Today, misnamed West Bank, right? Which is a propaganda term that we must divest of. It's Shomron, Judea and Samaria. It's the biblical names. Now, the King Solomon now travels to Samaria, Shomron, where he goes to the site of the Holy Tabernacle. I believe at that time it was in Shiloh, as Ben Shapiro mentioned the other night. And he goes there to thank God. As he arrives there, the king is now presented with a case, a very difficult case that he needs to judge. He needs to preside over. What's the case? Two mothers showed up, one of them holding a live baby, one of them holding a dead baby. Are you familiar with the story? The famous story, but it's good to review it even if you have heard it. The story goes that each one of them claimed that the living baby was hers and that the dead baby was the other's. They slept in the same bed, and each one said that the other one rolled over onto the baby at the middle of the night. They both had their babies in their bed. And what does Solomon do? How does he deal with the situation? How would he answer it? So what does he do? He uses he responds like this. He says, "Bring me a sword. Bring me a sword." And in front of the horrified onlookers, he instructs his guards to chop the baby in two so that each mother could get half. The horrified onlookers pitied the pathetic new king, the boy king, who had no idea, no concept of justice. But as soon as one mother began to scream and shout, "No, no, let her have the baby. Just don't harm the baby. Let her have the baby." As soon as one mother said that, King Solomon declared, "She is the true mother." And as he declared her the true mother, having been able to use parental instinct and emotional reactions to identify the true mother, dawned upon the people the true wisdom of this great new king. What were he to use the strict letter of the law? There's a basic principle in Jewish law, which is possession is 9/10 of the law. It's a principle in Jewish law, comes from the Talmud. If you want to extract something from someone else, the onus of proof is upon you, right? If whoever has possession is 9/10 of the law. So he should have allowed the mother who had the baby in her possession to take ownership, but he didn't. He didn't. He figured out a different way, and he dove deeper. His judgment relied on identifying who would show mercy and who was driven by envy, because the false mother was one who said, no, no, go ahead, go ahead. You know, misery loves company. If my child is dead, then your child should be dead too, right? This was an intuition that could not be taught, and that is what we're going to learn about today. Today we're going to learn about the intuition within the law, not the legal, strict letter of the law, but the spirit of the law, which needs to be customized and modified according to each specific case and scenario. It's common sense and empathy. By the way, there is another version of this story, which is about two Jewish mothers who were waiting at the train station. And each one of them believed that her future son-in-law was arriving at the train station, right? Both of them had daughters, and they were both exasperated that their daughters weren't getting married. So each one of them thought that their future son-in-law was arriving. Alas, lo and behold, just one young man gets off the train. So this one says, he's mine. No, he's mine. He's mine. No, he's mine. So they come schlepping this young man, this mystified young man, to the rabbi. And they say to the rabbi, this one says it's mine. This one says it's mine. So the two mothers-in-law are fighting over the boy, over the young man. So the rabbi says, goes Solomonic, and he says, bring out the sword. We're going to chop him in two. So one of the potential mothers-in-law says, no, 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 don't do it. Don't do it. Let him live. And the other one says, yeah, go right ahead. Chop him in two. And the wise rabbi says, the mother-in-law who says to chop him in two, that's the real mother-in-law. That's the modern day version of the story, right? So today, today we're going to focus on that element of the law. It's social awareness. It's human intuition. It's beyond the letter of the law. It's not just about being book smart. It's about being people smart. Now, this section of the law has actually got a name, and I'd like to draw your attention to it on page 191. The name of this kind of intuition. Page 191, this is a 19th century scholar who is the first recorded scholar to describe this genre of Jewish law. I remember the off-script conversations we had with my teacher, the great Rabbi Moshe Sofer, of blessed memory. Rabbi Moshe Sofer was the great Khatam Sofer, his teacher. He would tell us, take heed, my children, mastering the 4 sections of the Code of Jewish Law is a great achievement. You know, we have 4 sections of the Code of Jewish Law. I just want to show you them on the screen. The 4 sections of the Code of Jewish Law. The first one is the path of life. This is about daily routine Jewish life. The second one is called teaching knowledge. This is about permissible foods, idolatrous practices, usury, family purity. Then comes the stone of help. Stone of help refers to the laws of women, marriage, divorce, infidelity. And finally comes the breastplate of judgment. It's the 4th section of Jewish law. You can actually see this listed on page 192. We have a chart for you. The 4th section of the law on page 192 is about torts and legal procedures. So those are the 4 sections of Jewish law which he's referencing. So my teacher would say, he says back in 191, take heed, my children. Mastering the 4 sections of the Code of Jewish law is a great achievement, but it is within reach. The challenge lies in the 5th section of the Code of Jewish law, knowing how to guide a generation and a community according to its unique needs, knowing when to act and when to hold back, when to be lenient and when to be strict, and that requires extraordinary help from heaven. What we're learning today is therefore called the fifth portion, the 5th part of Jewish law. It's not, doesn't fit into a box. Doesn't fit into the boxes that you see in your textbook on page 192, but it's transcendent of the law. It's the intuition which the rabbi has to apply to guide a generation according to its unique generational needs. Now, effective guidance for a rabbi requires much more than academic knowledge. It demands an understanding of people's struggles and their emotional states. And that's why we can all master the written law, but knowing when to be lenient and when to be strict is based on the specific time and place, and it requires divine aid. How do you do this? You do this through a process called shimush, which is rabbinic apprenticeship, with an experienced mentor. A rabbi will typically mentor with a court or with a senior rabbi to be able to learn the context of how it is that they're supposed to apply the law. Instead of just going according to a cookie cutter mentality. And that's what we're going to do here today. We're going to be exploring this fifth section of the Code of Jewish Law through a robust understanding of people, how the rabbis exhibited that robust understanding of people. And we're going to do it through 5 cases today. The first case is going to teach us to see not just the question, but the questioner. The second case, and the second and the third both, will be teaching us to focus and take heed of the time and the unique time and place where the environment where the question is being asked. In the fourth case, we'll be detecting corruption, less than desirable motives that are disguised as piety. And finally, in the fifth case, we'll be exploring the context of greater communal good. Okay? So with that, let's get started. Our journey today is going to take us through 20th century English medical crises, 12th century Yemeni anti-Semitism, and we'll be meeting a 17th century Polish Jewish murderer, 19th century chickens in Russia again, and the 14th century will take us back to Spanish philanthropy. Okay, here goes. So the story goes about the famous Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, 19th century sage of the Brisk school of thought. Yes, he's an ancestor of that one who you learn with. Yes. Listen to this great story about his ancestors. I think it's his great-grandfather, the one from Yeshiva University, right? Okay. So a man once came over to him before Passover, to this Rabbi Soloveitchik. He passed away in 1892, in perspective. Came over to him and he asked him if it's permissible on Passover at the Seder to drink 4 cups, not of wine, but of milk. Can you fulfill the mitzvah of the 4 cups at the Seder with milk instead of wine? What do you think? No. No? Yeah, why not? Have to be wine. What does the wine remind you of? The wine reminds us of the blood that was spilled, right? In fact, in many Jewish communities, by the way, medieval times, they did not use red wine at the Seder. You know why? Because they didn't want it to look like they were drinking blood at the Seder because of the anti-Semitic pogroms, the blood libels. They would drink only white wine. So are you allowed to fulfill the mitzvah? And wine is freedom, and it's a special drink, and it makes us relax. So could you possibly fulfill the mitzvah with 4 cups of milk? The rabbi said to him, Rabbi Soloveitchik said, that's a very difficult question. And I don't have the time to do all the due diligence to research the answer to your question. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you 25 ruble right now, a large sum of money. Like, let's say, I don't know, say $5,000. So take this and let me deal with it after Passover. I don't have time to deal with it right now. It's too busy. So that's what his wife said to him. His wife said to him, why did you give him the money? I mean, everybody knows the answer to that question. The answer is no. Like Nancy said straight up, you're not allowed to fulfill the mitzvah to the 4 cups of wine. I mean, to 4 cups of milk, it's got to be 4 cups of wine. And he didn't even ask you for the money. So what? Harvey? Listen to what Harvey's doing. Harvey says, 1 second. He's asking if he can drink 4 cups of milk at the Passover Seder. What does that tell you about what he's going to be serving for dinner? Dairy. He's not going to be eating anything fleshik, any meat. If he doesn't have money for food, do you think he has money for matzah? What do you think his marriage looks like right now with his wife and children? This man came not for a question of milk, he came for a loan. See what happened over here? Reb Yosef Dov Soloveitchik answered not the question, He answered the questioner, the person asking the question. Another similar story. Modern day story. This happened in Crown Heights on a Friday night in New York a couple years ago. Rabbi Manas Friedman was walking alongside Rabbi Abba Paltiel, two rabbis, on a New York street corner, when they were confronted by a young married couple, newly married. And the young married couple, the wife, very bothered, she says to the two rabbis, she actually says to Rabbi Paltiel, the older one, she says to him, "Is it not true that you're not allowed to stir the soup whilst it's on the fire on Shabbos? You know, when you have soup on a fire on Friday night, right? You're actually, are you allowed to stir the soup on the pot, or do you have to take it off the fire before you can mix it?" Well, let me tell you, who cares? If you're stirring it on the pot, then you're technically cooking on Shabbos. Without getting into the technicalities of that, just go with that. So you're cooking on Shabbos. If it stays on the fire, which was cooked, which was left there from before Shabbos, you're good. You could move it over, and then you can do whatever you want. But if it's still on the fire, you're not allowed to stir it. So she asked the question: "Is it not true? Can you tell my husband if it's true that you're allowed to stir that you whether or not? Can you tell my husband whether you're not or not you're allowed to stir the pot on Shabbos whilst on the fire?" So Rabbi Paltiel says, "I don't know. It's actually a very difficult question. I don't know. I'll look it up. I don't know. Good question." So as they walk off, Rabbi Friedman goes, "That's not a difficult question. You're not allowed to stir the soup on the fire on Shabbos." So Rabbi Paltiel says to Rabbi Friedman, "She wasn't asking a question about soup. She was asking a question about marriage. They obviously had a fight. And she said, 'I'm going to prove you wrong.' And if I would have said the answer, if I would have said that, yeah, you're not allowed to do it, you're correct," she would have looked at her husband and said, 'You fool, you know nothing.' And what would have that have done to the marriage?" Once again, the rabbi was not answering the question. He was answering the questioner, which brings us to our first case. Here, we have a picture of the 4 cups of milk. See? And it wasn't a question about milk, it was a question about money. Okay, there you go. So the first question brings us into 20th century Manchester, England, where there was an incineration protocol in the infectious diseases ward in the hospital. Remember in COVID? I remember when I was diagnosed with COVID. My doctor came in, he was like all souped up. He looked like a beekeeper, and he was like, "You have to come and tell me." Couldn't hear a word behind the whole thing anyways. But yeah, infectious diseases. It was a very dangerous time, right? So the question was whether you're allowed to bring a contagious patient who was hospitalized in a facility where all items were incinerated, right? And the question is, would he be allowed to lay tefillin inside of the infectious diseases ward? What's the problem with laying tefillin there? Problem is, you would eventually have to incinerate the tefillin. They can never come out of there, right? So, what do you think is the answer, folks? What do you say? Let's see what the great Rabbi of Manchester, Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Weiss, had to answer on page 194. This is his letter, by the grace of God, Friday, Erev Shabbos. Parshas Re'eh, 1963. It's page 194. To Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Perlkatz, who asked the question. A patient with a contagious disease is hospitalized in a facility where all items patients bring in are incinerated. Is it permitted to bring tefillin there to fulfill the mitzvah? Tefillin is something we use every single day, except for Shabbos and Jewish holidays. That's how we pray. I've already written in my book, that I'm inclined to say that one should not bring tefillin so as not to risk the severe desecration involved in their burning. See there, question answered. Done. The answer is no, like Nancy said. As to what you wrote, that it isn't certain that they will be burned, for perhaps researchers will discover a new cure, and the illness will no longer be contagious, and the incineration protocol will be lifted. I mean, that's a big baby. Certainly, this is an unlikely possibility. Even though in recent times science has discovered many new treatments, it is well known that when it comes to caution around contagious diseases, the medical field is more stringent today than in previous generations. Consequently, the likelihood that the incineration protocol will be lifted is remote, not happening. Sure. No, no. As long as it stays until eventually it's gonna be burned one time, right? You're not allowed to burn tefillin. If you burn a Torah, you gotta like, God forbid, you gotta like sit shiva, you know? So if you drop a Torah, it's a problem. Huh. I think that would be a problem because he might get the disease from the previous patient. So probably not a good idea. So, so the question was whether or not he can use the tefillin, and the answer was negative. You can't use the tefillin. The ruling, however, was revised after recognizing that withholding the tefillin would cause him significant emotional distress. I can tell you, since the day of my bar mitzvah, I'm grateful to say that I've not missed a day of tefillin. Except for Shabbos and Jewish holidays, where we don't lay the tefillin. For me, not to lay tefillin is like unthinkable. If I didn't lay tefillin one day, it's not about feeling naked. I'd feel, I don't even know what I would feel like. This is the anchor, the spiritual anchor of my day. Can you imagine somebody who's most vulnerable in the ICU of infectious diseases? He needs the tefillin more than anybody on a good day, right? Because the ruling was revised after recognizing that the emotional pain of missing a commandment so fundamental as tefillin could worsen the patient's health. Let's see what happened here on the next page 196. He's continuing the same letter. However, so initially I said you can lay tefillin. However, I was prompted to reconsider by a distinguished Torah scholar who argued that withholding the tefillin could cause significant distress to a God-fearing patient, deeply pained by his inability to fulfill the mitzvah. Such emotional anguish might even compromise the patient's physical health. In light of this, there is room to be lenient and permit bringing tefillin to the hospital. This scholar showed me that the great and righteous Lubavitcher Rebbe, that would be the Rabbi Schneerson, may he be well, wrote to him this line of thinking regarding a patient for whom there was a question of whether he was permitted to pray and study Torah. The question was the question of a catheter. This particular patient had a catheter, which collected urine, right? So he had urine like in a bag, I guess. I don't know what that's called. A what? I forget what it's called. The bag of urine. Should never know. But he had a catheter, and he had bodily waste in his vicinity. Now, you're not supposed to pray in a bathroom. It's a law. You're not supposed to pray in a bathroom. If you're in a bathroom, you can't pray. So the question was posed to the Rebbe, somebody who has a catheter, is he allowed to lay tefillin ever, or is he like a walking bathroom? Right? Good question. So let's see what happens. Therefore, so in that case, the Rebbe said that he would be allowed. And we'll see in a moment. Therefore, in our case, well, I'm just going to explain to you first. So here, the chassid was fitted with the catheter, right? There it is. He was fitted with the catheter. And this is a question posed to the Rebbe. So the first thing that the Rebbe said was, sorry about that, is it's not really urine. Because urine goes through a specific process that originates maybe in the kidneys and ends all the way at the urethra. But when it comes to a catheter, it takes an early exit, so it doesn't actually qualify as proper bodily waste, number one. Number two, the Rebbe said that there's a biblical obligation to lay tefillin every day. That's a biblical 613 commandments. Not praying in a bathroom is actually a rabbinical prohibition. And the biblical obligation actually far outweighs a rabbinical concern. But then the Rebbe added the kicker here. When the Rebbe said that preventing the patient from praying or studying would lead to emotional and physical distress. And this is something that the Rebbe very much empathized with. So that's how the Rebbe put it. And I want to... Here, I'm just going to finish this quote over here on page 196. Therefore, in our case, if the patient asks for tefillin, and we know that he will suffer greatly if he cannot fulfill the mitzvah, remember this is the guy in the infectious disease unit, and there is concern that his distress may cause mental deterioration, we should rule leniently. After all, there is no definitive ruling in this case, and my prior ruling prohibiting the tefillin was only that due to the doubt it is preferable to remain passive. Therefore, he's reversing his decision. Under the above-mentioned circumstances, we shall allow him to bring tefillin so that he may fulfill the mitzvah and be at ease. So what did the Rebbe actually say? Yes, Phyllis? You remember those people dying alone? It was the most horrific thing. They died without anyone around them. Well, yeah, it was horrific. It was really difficult times. Yeah, absolutely. So we could relate. So let's see what the Rebbe actually said. Let's take a look. It's on page 198. The Rebbe said something so sensitive, so beautiful, so precious. Page 198. Preventing this patient from praying or studying Torah will certainly lead to emotional distress, and consequently may also weaken the patient's physical health. Several practices have been permitted when this concern is relevant. What are the practices that have been instituted when this concern is relevant? What happened was that there's a law that if somebody's dying, and they want to make a deathbed bequest, like a gift, a deathbed gift. So instead of calling their lawyers and doctor, whatever else, they are allowed to verbally, their verbal words are binding. Okay? All that needs to happen is you need to do something called a kinyan. A kinyan is to take like an object and to lift it up. And by you thus acquire that object. So in exchange for acquiring this object, your word is now binding. It's a principle in Talmudic law. It's how laws are binding. For example, if you've been to a wedding and you have the witnesses, if you look closely, the witnesses give the groom an article to pick up like this, and he picks it up. And in exchange for picking it up, which he now owns, he acquires this object. His word in the ketubah is now committed, right? So when somebody's on his deathbed, he's allowed to make a acquisition, a gift through a kinyan. But what happens on Shabbos? On Shabbos, you're not allowed to do business. On Shabbos, you're not allowed to do a kinyan. You're not allowed to lift an object. So Nebuch, this guy's dying. He doesn't think he's going to make it to nightfall, but he wants to make sure that his possessions are going to not go to the state. They're going to go to, maybe he doesn't have kids, and he wants to bequeath it to the shul, or to the charity, or to the school, or to Israel, right? And he's distressed. The rabbis made a special dispensation. They said that he's allowed to do the kinyan, the business deal on Shabbos. Why? Because he's going to be in a state of emotional distress if he cannot gift this legally to the entity that he's giving it to. So the Rebbe says, just like we see in other cases of people that are very, very ill, that withholding from them the ability to do what they want to do will cause them emotional and therefore physical distress. Therefore, in our case as well, when the guy wants to lay tefillin whilst wearing a catheter, we have to allow it to them because otherwise it will cause them tremendous distress. You know, there's the story. Yeah. About the acquisition? Oh, about the catheter. Which one are you talking about? Look, we're talking about people that are very, very God-fearing and people that want to do everything according to the will of God. I was dealing with a very complex case today about an acquisition that's taking place in Passover. And we had to deal with a very, very complex situation where there was a potential acquisition of chametz by a group of Jewish people on Passover. So we needed to figure out a workaround language and ways to be able to allow this transaction to proceed on Passover in middle days under certain circumstances without violating the law of Passover, right? So, I mean, you could say, well, who cares? You could do that. But we're talking about people that are concerned with doing it according to the law. And for that, you need a rabbi who's, teaching what it says in the Torah. There was another story of a guy who he was on his deathbed, and he tells his family members, he tells his son, to you, Charlie, I'm leaving the office buildings downtown West Palm. To you, Rachel, I bequeath the coastal properties in Palm Beach. And to Heather, he gives her the high rises in PGA. Finally turns to his wife and she says, to you, my love, you can have all the residential buildings. And with that, he passes away. The nurse is floored. This man was such an oligarch. Like, it was incredible. She turns to the family. She says, Your father, your husband was I didn't realize what a giant of a businessman he must have been. Oh no, says the family. Those were his newspaper roots. There's another one about the teacher, a sixth grade teacher. Sixth grade teacher, she turns to her students and she says, a man dies, and before he dies, he leaves $10 million. He leaves $10 million to his family. He leaves one fifth to his wife, one fifth to his son, one fifth to his daughter, one sixth to his butler, and the rest to charity. What does each one get? Asked the teacher. Little Tommy says, I know. Each one gets a lawyer. Okay, so the Rebbe brought out this case. The Rebbe brought out the case of where there would be emotional suffering caused to the person who's dying and not able to grant the gift of his assets to whomever he wants to give it to. And therefore, in Shabbos, they allowed a special dispensation to allow him to do the kinyan, the acquisition on Shabbos. It was allowed for dying person to settle their affairs so as not to hasten their demise. In the same way, when somebody's got a catheter, the Rebbe said, and it's going to cause him tremendous emotional suffering by not laying tefillin, let him lay tefillin. When the other rabbis in Manchester heard what the Rebbe had taught, when they realized that the Rebbe had taught that the empathy that the Rebbe opened their eyes to, they realized that in the same way that you have to be empathetic of the spiritual needs and emotional needs of the Jew with the catheter, you have to do it for the Jew in the infectious diseases. And they therefore ruled that they reversed the ruling on the tefillin in infectious diseases because they realized that the Rebbe saw the person, not just the question. Remarkable, however, is to note the incredible humility of this rabbi, who says, I already ruled on this case, and I was wrong. I'm reversing my ruling to say that this is absolutely permissible under the circumstances. What changed? Not the law that changed. It was the fifth portion of the law. It was the empathy of understanding and feeling the pain of the patient, as opposed to looking at this as some cold, objective case. Yes. What impact does that have on precedent? This is reversing the precedent.
Question is that then affect that question forever?
Yeah. From then on, that question became our eyes have been illuminated. And it was this rabbi's humility that allowed us to experience that reversal, which is a very beautiful thing. It's actually the opposite of precedent. It's reverse precedent of what we learned in lesson 2 or 3, right? Beautiful. Let's move on from a case of medical, spiritual sensitivities to a case of anti-Semitism, 2 cases of anti-Semitism. Let's move to 12th century Yemen, where there was an anti-Semitic ruler who was forcing the Jews to convert to Islam. The Jewish people were terrified at that time. In addition to the threat of forced conversion by the Muslims, they also were facing the rise of an alleged Messiah, a Jewish man who stood up and he declared himself the Redeemer, the Savior, the Messiah of the Jewish people. And it's within that context that I want to introduce to you the revealing letter that Maimonides wrote back to Rabbi Yaakov ben Nesanel of Yemen. He writes to him a letter in which Rabbi Yaakov ben Nesanel of Yemen asks Maimonides how to deal with this guy who thinks he's the Messiah. He was providing hope to the downtrodden. Let's see what Maimonides writes back to him. Here it is on page 200. Maimonides writes, you mentioned that the ruler of Yemen decreed a forced conversion on the Jews and compelled all the inhabitants of his domain to renounce their faith as the Almohads did in Morocco and Spain. Maimonides ran away from the Almohads in Morocco and Spain. He was born in Cordoba, but he had to run. He was now probably in Egypt by now, where he wrote this famous epistle to Yemen. He was very familiar with these forced conversions. This was the ISIS of the 12th century. This news had shaken us to our core and left our communities, all of our communities, alarmed. You also mentioned the confusion of the decree caused amongst some people, leading them to falter in their faith and lose their belief, while others' faith remained intact. In his letter, which we don't have here entirely, but Maimonides describes a very beautiful snapshot, a very painful snapshot of what was going on at that time, the terrifying environment where Jews were forced to choose between hiding their faith or death. In this letter, Maimonides masterfully infuses hope and encouragement. It's a famous letter called the Epistle of Yemen, to Yemen. He explained the nature of anti-Semitism, the uniqueness of Judaism, and how to respond to the misleading Islamic claims. Today, we'll zero in on just one point, which is about the messianic claimant. It's about the guy who claimed to be the Messiah. Let's see what Maimonides has to say about him. On page 202, you wrote about, he continues in the letter, you wrote about the man who boasted of being the Mashiach, the Messiah of Yemen. I'm neither surprised by him, says Maimonides, nor by those who follow him. I'm not surprised about him, for he is undoubtedly deranged. And there is no shame in an illness that's not self-inflicted. As for those who follow him, their behavior is due to their suffering and their ignorance about the lofty stature of the Mashiach. What surprised me was your doubt about this matter, given that you, the questioning rabbi, are a learned person and who has seen the words of sages. I'm surprised that you wrote about this claimant that he is, quote, known for his piety and possesses a bit of wisdom. That's not exactly an accolade, right? A bit of wisdom. Do these qualities make someone Mashiach, God's Messiah? Mashiach will be in stature highest amongst the prophets and the most distinguished after Moses. A prophet must be supremely wise to be granted prophecy by God. As our sages taught, prophecy only rests upon one who is wise, strong, and wealthy. They clarified that strong refers to conquering inner temptation and wealthy refers to being rich in knowledge. Accordingly, we will not believe an ignorant person who claims to be a prophet, how much more so when he claims to be the Mashiach. We know of this man's ignorance because you related how he commanded people to give all their wealth to charity. You're not supposed to do that, and they did not obey him. They acted correctly by not giving all their wealth to charity. While he sinned, the Talmud teaches that one who gives generously should not give more than 20% of their assets to charity. The maximum you're supposed to give to charity is 1/5. This guy's telling you to give everything to charity? That's not smart, right? So Maimonides disqualifies the claimant. He says that the man lacks Torah scholarship and he acts irrationally. Now, we can understand Maimonides' position. He claims that the man lacked the qualifications to be the Mashiach. Fine. But what about this other rabbi, Rabbi Yaakov ben Nesanel? Like, why did he think that, that this guy could possibly be the Mashiach? What was he even thinking? If we were to apply the 5th portion of Jewish law, if we were to apply common sense outside of the box, why do you think the rabbi was wording his question this way? Why would he say, I think he's the Messiah because he has a bit of wisdom? What is he saying? Perhaps what he's saying is that look who he was dealing with. Look at the time and place. This was the time of forced conversion. Can you imagine what that even feels like? Where you are forced to convert, and if not, you're going to be killed and your properties will be seized. Your children will be taken captive. These people were clutching at a straw. And now some guy shows up and he says, I'm the Messiah. What do you think the masses were doing? They wanted to believe in him. And if their rabbi, Rabbi Yaakov ben Nesanel, says, oh no, he's a fraud, they'd probably stone the rabbi. No, we need this guy. Why are you being such a Debbie Downer? Debbie Downer. Right, Debbie Downer. Doubting Thomas, Debbie Downer. Together. Right, okay. Right. Why are you doing this? Don't do that. They would have totally rejected the rabbi. That's why he gave a code to Maimonides. I think he's the Messiah because he's got a bit of wisdom. That's like saying, I think this person should be president of the United States of America because he was born near America. What are you telling me, sir? You know what I mean? You're like telling me something here, right? Clearly he's not qualified, but you don't want to be the one to say it. You want me to say it? Fine, I'll say it. Why did he need Maimonides to say it? Because they needed a giant of the generation to say it in order to sway the people into the right direction. He needed Maimonides to be the one to say that this guy is deranged. And that would be what was going to give these people a serious heavyweight to be able to counter their passion. After calling him crazy, Maimonides proceeds to offer practical advice. And what does he do? He brings the fifth factor to the table. Maimonides understood the time and place that they were in. How do you think the Muslims who were forcing the Jews to convert, how do you think they were going to react if there was going to be a Jewish Messiah? They'll kill them all, right? They kill everybody. Maimonides is like, you're playing with dynamite here. Stay far away. Don't touch this guy with a 10-foot pole. And that's how Maimonides advised the community to label the man as Meshuggah to prevent the government charges of rebellion, that nobody should associate him with the community. And here's what he tells them to do. Take a look at text 4c on page 204. I will offer you sound advice for the benefit of both the messianic pretender, he's saving the guy's life, and for your entire community. Imprison this man for a time until it becomes widely known amongst the non-Jews that he is mentally unstable. Make this public knowledge and then release him. By doing this, you will save him. When the non-Jews hear of his claims, they will mock him and consider him a madman. Even your own people don't believe you, as he truly is, but they will leave him alone. This maneuver will also protect your community from persecution. However, if you allow him to remain free until his actions become known to the non-Jews, they will likely execute him. He may also become a cause for persecution against the entire community. If this guy walks around the non-Jews and he starts telling them, I'm the Messiah, they're going to think that he was sent by you guys and they're going to kill you all. If Maimonides is going by the strict letter of the law, he might have had a whole evaluation, a vetting process to figure out if this guy might be the Messiah or not. But he wasn't interested in doing that. Because the fifth portion of the Code of Jewish Law says, no way, no way. You can't do that because that's going to result in a massacre. And we just don't have the ability to protect ourselves from a massacre at this time. Here's the rabbi, Maimonides, 12th century Yemen, who's able to sense and realize the danger that's lurking right around the corner. So he's using his intuition, the fifth portion of the Code of Jewish Law, to be able to come up with the answer. Yes, Phyllis?
But there was no indication that the time was right for this Messiah. So how would we know when the person comes to us? Will they tell us?
So the question is being asked when the Messiah actually does come. How are we going to know? The answer is, you'll know. That's the answer. It's going to be on CNN. It's going to be on Fox News. It's going to be on Instagram. It's going to be everywhere. That's it. You'll know. If you don't know, it's not him. You know what I mean? It's not him. When he comes, he'll come. He'll come with a bang. No. But really, it actually says, it says in the books and the prophecies that when the Messiah will come, a great shofar will sound. The shofar will sound from one end of the world to the other. Could that be the voice of social media, which will ring across the world? Sounds like it. When he comes, we'll know. That's the tradition. This case that we just learned about Maimonides and the madman Messiah madman, was a case that really had no practical impact on the legal conclusion. The rabbi was basically telling them, listen, just let this guy go. Let him live as a deranged person as opposed to getting killed and getting everybody else killed as well. But let's move on to a third case now, which is the Poland, 17th century, where we'll find a case where the fifth portion of the law actually changed the result, the ruling, how the case was actually ruled. This is the curious case of a Jewish assassin. Very unusual, right? We don't do too many of those. The Jewish ruffian. I guess today we're accused of all day and all night, right? You heard about Tucker? He was genocided in Israel, in Tel Aviv luxury terminal, right? Okay, so a Jewish ruffian murdered 2 Jews on Shabbos, and he stood to be executed by the Polish authorities. The year was 1615. So he is being held by the Polish authorities, convicted of murdering 2 other Jews on Shabbos. So he's going to be killed. The question was asked, if the Jewish community should rise up to spare him from death, how would they do that? You see, in those curious times, the Jews were actually quite empowered with the power of self-governance. They were actually empowered to have their own courts. And if they wanted to extend their own jurisdiction over this case, they could have said to the Polish authorities, hand him over to us, we will deal with him. Because they had self-governance in the 17th century Poland. And then they could have tried him, and they could have determined if he should live, if he should die, if he should get some other form of punishment. And that is the context of the question, where the question was asked, should the Jewish community intervene to take him, to extradite him from the Polish authorities and save his life, or not? What do you think? Anybody say where they should let him die? Yeah, let him die. Anybody say save him? He is guilty. Is there any reason to save him? Good question. See, that's a very good question. Maybe it's mental illness, maybe something going on, right? It's interesting. It's, sometimes it's things you don't think about, right? It's very interesting, folks. So Rabbi Meir of Lublin wrote a letter to Reb Shmuel. He was the chief judge of Przemysl, I can't pronounce that, a Polish city. And the question was, should the community intervene to save a Jewish killer from a secular execution? Reb Shmuel offered several reasons why they should not allow him to be killed against the death penalty in defense of the murderer. One reason was because only the High Court in Jerusalem, the Court of 71, has the power to execute. And we're not that. Number two, this wasn't a problem in the Jewish community. This was a very unusual, unprecedented case. And finally, if we cannot execute him, we must at least, we have to save his life, right? If we're not allowed to execute him, then we should save his life. We should. That's what they said. That's what Rabbi Shmuel said. But now we're going to read the letter which Rabbi Meir of Lublin responds to him on text 5a. Here it is. So page 205, let's see what the rabbi responded to this rabbi who wanted to save the life of the Jewish assassin. To the distinguished Rabbi Shmuel, I received the verdict you issued regarding the hideous and aberrant act. The murder committed by one of the ruffians amongst our people, as noted in the affidavits that you sent to me. The murderer is in the custody of the Polish police, and his fate has yet to be decided. You requested my opinion, and on this, and whether you are judging correctly is in absolving him of the death penalty. You want to absolve him. Although I am not yet settled and do not have my sacred books with me, as they are still in Lublin. Remember the lesson one of this course we had the rabbi in the Holocaust in Auschwitz. He said, I don't have my books. I don't want to rule this case. Similar, right? I don't have my books. He was traveling. I will respond briefly. Let's see what he said. In his response, Rabbi Meir is going to argue 3 points. He's going to say that, in fact, any qualified court is allowed to execute. If you have the powers of self-governance by the Polish authorities, you are, in fact, allowed. This is a very sensitive case today in America about, the death penalty. It's a big question in America. Right? Do we do the death penalty? Do we not do the death penalty? I think blue states probably don't do it. The red states probably do it, right? Very big controversy in America. Same question, right? So if the courts allow you to execute, then you should. You have the right to do it. Also, said the Rabbi Meir, if you're going to kill this guy, it will be a deterrent to other criminals. Even if it's not an existing problem, still, it's got to serve as an example. And number 3, therefore, the Jewish community has no obligation to shield him. Right? Let's see how he explains this. Oh, but one thing I want to say is that before we read what he says, he added an additional reason. There was an additional reason, and that was from the 5th portion of the law. From the intuitive, empathetic portion of the law. He says that the long-term consequence of such inaction would have catastrophic effects on the local Gentile community. If you were not to execute him, it would be catastrophic in terms of anti-Semitic relations with the Gentiles. Let's see what he says. So it's page 207. Since this matter, he continues in his letter, since this matter has become known amongst the non-Jews and the criminal is sitting in prison amongst the non-Jews, if you allow him to live, it will be a disgrace to the Jewish community and to our values. Moreover, the non-Jews may be emboldened in the future to show leniency in the punishment of Gentiles Who shed Jewish blood, God forbid? This concern is obvious. God has thankfully arranged that he's already in the hands of the local authorities. So the best course of action is for the Jewish court to have no involvement in this matter. Just do nothing. Just stay out of it. Rather, the victims' families should demand capital punishment as retribution from the Polish authorities. Through this, the societal breach will be repaired. The name of heaven will be sanctified because Jews aren't being pathetic. And all of Israel will be blameless. It wasn't even our fault. I have written what appears to me as the law in my limited understanding. Peace be you and to all the judges of Israel. Signed, Meir, the son of our teacher, Rabbi Gedalia, of blessed memory. And that's his answer. He says that his ruling stated that to protect the killer, for the Jewish courts to intervene and to protect the Jewish assassin would disgrace the Jewish faith. It would make us look weak, unjust, and would embolden others to target Jews without fear of reprisal. Failure to pursue justice would imply that Jewish blood is cheap, and that is a price that is too expensive to pay. And that's why he says it doesn't look good to outsiders. This is the fifth section of the law. And he says the Poles will be lax in punishing anti-Jewish crimes. And that's how he rules, where he says the fifth factor of the law is actually what changes the ruling from Rabbi Shmuel, who says maybe there is a reason to defend him and to save his life, but because of the fifth factor of the law, it was enough to balance the law to go to the opposite side and to say that, in fact, we have to let him die. Yeah.
The Jewish criminal get into the courts of the Poles.
How did he get caught by the courts of the Poles? Well, clearly, he was caught by the Poles. It's kind of like in Israel today. There's the Israeli police and then there's the Arab police. And, they could extradite. It's two, what are they called? Two departments in the same area. Or it could be like in America. It could be like you could have local Palm Beach Gardens police and the state police, and you got the federal police, and you got the county police, and the FBI, and they're all in the same case. I'm sorry, Robin, you were saying something.
Guilty, but there are cases where there's anti-Semitism involved.
Right.
Going after.
Such as the cases we've learned in recent weeks. Right. So clearly, in that case, had that been the case here, the ruling would have been completely different. They would have had a public trial and declared him innocent and figured out if they could self-govern. Typically, when there is such anti-Semitic libels, the Jews don't have self-governance. So it's a double-edged sword. He had the affidavits. He said he had the affidavits. He had testimony. Rob.
Or finding in jail the rest of his life?
No, they were probably going to execute him. Well, the case was like this. If they would leave him to the authorities, they would probably execute him. The Poles would probably execute him. Had they, what Rabbi Shmuel wanted to do was to chop off a limb, like chop off a hand or something, and the rabbis felt very strongly against that, because what would happen then is he would feel rejected by his people. He'd probably go over to the Gentiles and become a very negative influence of anti-Semitism. So that's an interesting case. Let me just share with you a quick story here of a similar case, which I want to bring to your attention. So a new case, different.
In 17th century Moravia, a Jewish traveller was murdered on the road. The identity of the non-Jewish assailant was no mystery, but in those days, justice did not stir unless it was demanded. A relative of the victim had to initiate a private suit, which entailed paying prosecutors, judges, and various civic officials. In this instance, the victim's relatives hesitated. Perhaps the task was too daunting. Perhaps the financial burden was too great. Whatever the reason, they failed to act, and the murderer remained free. The leaders of the Jewish community grew anxious. They turned to Rabbi Menachem Mendel Krochmal of Nikolsburg in the southeast region of the modern-day Czech Republic. Could the communal leadership, they asked, exercise its authority to compel the victim's relatives to sue the killer in the Moravian courts? And If the relatives possessed sufficient means, could they be obligated to bear the legal costs involved? Rabbi Krochmal drew on the Talmud to respond affirmatively, but he also drew a line. Given the endemic corruption, bribes or purchased letters of recommendation were often required to advance a case through the bureaucratic mire. These costs, the rabbi clarified, could not be imposed upon the family. Otherwise, relatives of victims fearing financial ruin would escape to other towns, and murderers would go unpunished. Rabbi Krochmal invoked a Talmudic precedent. The sages recount how, in ancient Israel, funeral rites had become so extravagant that some families, unable to meet the costs, abandoned their dead. Rabban Gamliel reversed this trend by requesting to be buried in simple linen. Once this became the norm, no one abandoned their dead anymore. So too here, Rabbi Krochmal reasoned, render the pursuit of justice prohibitively expensive, and justice itself will disappear. In cases when bribes were needed to bring the killer to justice, Rabbi Krochmal stated that the Jewish community must assume responsibility for the expenses. Why? Because failure to do so would place all members of the community in peril. If no charges were brought, if Jewish blood could be shed without consequence, every merchant, every student, and every family who ventures onto the road will do so in danger. He reminded the community that it had long been the accepted practice for Jewish leadership to seek justice, even when the prospects of conviction were dim. These cases were brought before the Moravian courts to declare publicly and unequivocally that Jewish blood is not ownerless. Rabbi Krochmal was not merely a jurist who interpreted sacred texts. He was a leader who understood how incentives shape action and how perception determines public safety. In a world where justice was fragile, Rabbi Krochmal found a way to protect his community through deep human understanding.
So these three cases, the case of the Yemeni anti-Semitic decree, the case of the Jewish assassin in Poland, and this story here, all show us the sensitivity, tremendous sensitivity that the rabbis need to exhibit when they issue a ruling. That it's got to incorporate the time and the place, the environment in which this is taking place. What are the ripple effects? What are the long-term and short-term consequences of your actions? If you don't force the whole community to support the trial, then nobody's going to be safe, right? People will run away if their obligation is if the obligation is upon themselves alone. It's going to bankrupt them. They're going to not want to file charges. It's too dangerous. A beautiful insight into the fifth section of the law. But let's move on to some shorter cases, smaller ones. And this one is about the kosher chickens. Now, we've learned about the kosher chickens already. We learned about them in a previous lesson here. I think it was in lesson 2. We learned that there are 24 non-kosher birds listed in the Torah. But we don't exactly know the identity of the 24 that are listed in the Torah. So therefore it became a situation that only the ones that we know are kosher are actually kosher. So what happened was, we learned that Rabbi Naftali Horowitz in lesson 2, we learned that he traveled with a bird, picked up a bird in Cyprus, and he took it off to Galicia in order to confirm that this bird was in fact a kosher bird. The case was settled in the mid-19th century. Case is settled. But in 1871, the case rose up again in Dubrovna in Russia, where, again, the same question arose, even though it had already been answered about these particular chickens. So the local rabbi of Dubrovna, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Tumarkin, authored a response permitting the new breeds of chicken. The problem was, by the way, that if they would interbreed these chickens with the questionable chickens, then every resultant chicken around would be a non-kosher chicken. There'd be the end of kosher chickens. That would be a huge problem for us. No more chicken soup. Huge. So Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Tumarkin authored a teshuvah, response permitting the new breeds. And he sent his response to the Rebbe Maharash, who's the 4th Rebbe of Chabad, to weigh in on his decision. The Rebbe agreed with what the rabbi wrote, and he sent him some additional points to support his argument. Let's focus on the final paragraph where the Chabad rabbi, Rabbi Maharash, says something which is quite startling. And that would be on text number 6, page 210. So this is the very final section of the letter that the Rebbe Maharash, the Chabad Rebbe, wrote to Rabbi Tumarkin, who supporting him about his allowing these birds to be kosher. He says, for all these reasons, it seems to me that these chickens are permitted to be eaten. The humble shall eat and be satisfied. In our town of Lubavitch, they are eaten without the slightest hesitation. I have also heard that this matter has already been thoroughly investigated and they were ruled kosher already. Similarly, in places nearby, such as Vitebsk and the surrounding areas, the accepted practice is to treat them as kosher. Now, this is the kicker. The stringencies have originated with the slaughterers. The stringencies have originated with the slaughterers, says the Rebbe Shmuel, and the tax lessees of your community as chickens bring them less revenue. Ouch. What the Rebbe Maharash was saying is like, we've already settled this issue a couple decades ago. The reason this has come up now is by the slaughterers. You know who the slaughterers are? These are some of the most pious people in the community. You see, a slaughterer is the person who slaughters the chicken to make sure it's kosher, or an animal. In order for a slaughter to be kosher, the knife has got to be perfectly sharp. How do you make sure the knife is perfectly sharp? Very long knife. You know, my father was a slaughterer. So when he first came to South Africa from Israel in the 1970, he was asked to come and slaughter animals in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia in those days. Now, my father didn't speak English. Just a little bit of English. He's Israeli. So when he came to the border, they opened his suitcase and they found knives like this long. They were like, sir, what is this? So he says, to kill. He said, to kill. Yeah. I think he had a lot of explaining to do. Somebody had a lot of explaining to do. But these knives are very, very sharp. And how do you know that they're sharp? What the slaughterer has to do, he has to run the knife on his fingernail, so that even the tiniest nick will be felt only by him. Nobody else will know. So he's got to be truly God-fearing to know that all the meats that he slaughtered today are kosher. Because if he was lazy, and who cares? If he was lazy, only he would know. Nobody else would know the difference. It's got to be very, very God-fearing people, is the people that are slaughtering the kosher meats. Says the Rebbe Maharash, it's the slaughterers that are behind it. Why? Because of their financial interests. You see, what happened was that the slaughterers were paid little. They were paid, when they slaughtered large animals, they were paid by the animal. But when they slaughtered the chickens, because they're little baby animals, they don't get paid by the head. They get paid by the hourly wage. So it's far more in their financial interests to slaughter beefs, than it was to slaughter like goats or cows or sheep, than it was to slaughter a chicken. So they were actually interested in exposing the chickens as non-kosher. Like, the heck with the chicken. We don't want to have chickens anymore. We don't get paid enough for chickens. In addition, there were officials who stood to earn higher fees from animals like cattle, creating a bias against cheaper poultry. Why? Because the community had a meat tax to the Russian government. It was called the korobka. Korobka is a Russian word which means box, like a tax box. So the korobka was a special box that they had to pay a meat tax, and the private tax collectors, would buy the rights to manage these taxes for the government, and then they would collect it for themselves. They would keep the rest for themselves. So they wanted to collect more taxes on the bigger animals than less taxes on the smaller animals. So that's why they try to ban the chickens as treif. And this is what the Rebbe Maharash is pointing at. He's saying that the slaughterers were paid little to nothing for chickens, and the tax collectors received more for the larger animals. And that is the reason. This is why this question has arisen altogether in the first place. And this is very, very encouraging, because, you see people that might look very religious. They might look very pious. They might look very frum. Frum means religious Jews. And some might fear that the rabbis might side with the pious, the guy that looks very religious. The rabbi might side with him. But this is not the case, because the 5th section of the Jewish law says you've got to smell what's really going on over here. Think about it. The case is already resolved in lesson 2. Why are we talking about this in lesson 5? because somebody had a vested interest in bringing the case back up again, even if they looked like they were a rabbi or a shochet or something else. And that is very encouraging for us to realize that it's actually a good idea to understand the context. And that's why I said the Rebbe Marash, absolutely, we eat them without any reservation, without any hesitation. Go right ahead and eat your heart out with the chicken soup. Our final case for today is a similar case to the one we had a few weeks ago, where a shul in Barcelona in the 14th century needed to be expanded. Remember, we had a problem with expanding synagogues. You weren't allowed to expand synagogues in some places, but also if you expand, remember the seats in the synagogue were owned real estate by the people who sat there. They were like a parking spot in New York City. They were like a house in Palm Beach Gardens. If you had a seat in the synagogue, you had status. But if you didn't have status. And that was your seat. You owned it. You could rent it out to someone. You could lease it out. It's like a summer house. It's like an Airbnb, right? So the case happened that there was a guy whose house was next door to the shul. He owned a beautiful house next door to the shul, and it was connected. Now, they wanted to actually expand the seating, but the problem was they couldn't, because if they expanded the seating, they wanted to take the wall down. He wanted to donate his house to the synagogue to expand the seating. Problem was that if he did that, then he would decrease the value of the seats that were already in the synagogue. Right? Because if there was only 50 seats in the synagogue, now it's going to be 100 seats in the synagogue, then the value of those seats is going to go down. Who wants to do that? It's like building a new neighborhood next door to your existing neighborhood. It becomes, your home prices go down. So everybody was opposed. They're like, no more seats in the synagogue. So he donates his house and he makes it an expanded Aron Kodesh, an expanded Holy Ark area, like a place in front of the Ark. Especially if you go to Sephardic synagogue, they're very ornate. If you've been to Venice or, these kind of places, you see the Sephardic synagogues, they have very ornate arks, right? The place in front of the ark is typically, it's like another room sometimes. So that's what he did. And the question was whether the donor has the right to inscribe his name over the ark as a donation, a donation plaque. But the community members said, no, we don't want your name on the plaque, on the ark. On the ark. There's a big debate over here in Palm Beach Gardens. There was a huge story here in the JCC. Somebody donated a big portion to the JCC, put his name up. And there was a whole court case going on. I don't know if it's still finished or not, but there was a whole thing about taking down the name. Somebody wanted the name off, somebody wanted the name on. It was complicated, right? This is not nasty philanthropy, right? So this is the question. Who do you think has the right? Do you think he has the right to put his name up? Do you think they have the right to prevent him from putting his name up? I mean, think about it. They have to stare at his name for the rest of their lives, right? There's a guy who donated like a little candle in a shul somewhere that I go to very often. He donated like a little eensy-weensy candle, and it stands right in front of the shul, and it's got his name right on top of it. Donated by, the guy spent $20 on this candle, but maybe 50, okay? And his name is always in front of my face every time that I'm praying in that synagogue. And I'm like, it could be a little annoying, like seriously. Like you'll notice in our shul here, we kept all the names in the lobby. They're all in the lobby. Sometimes you will go to a shul and you'll see every screw in the wall has got a plaque around it. The bathrooms, the urinals, everything's got a plaque above it, right? Some shuls are like that. We wanted to keep it pretty. We put everything nicely in the lobby. But hey, one man's bread is another man's poison. So what happened here is that should they have the right to put their name up or not? You think they should? Okay, very good. God bless you. Yeah, see, it's interesting. Like we had a story here. Somebody wanted to donate a small item to the ark, like a very small item. Or somebody donated a Torah. Good example. Somebody donated a Torah. And somebody else wanted to donate the cover of the Torah and have their name on it. Now, you can see why they'll get a little touchy. Like seriously, this guy gave 20 times the amount and you, because you're on the outside, come on, that's not fair, right? So this is where people were upset about this. So my Rashba, Rabbi Shimon ben Aderes, responds with a fascinating response. Very interesting. Here's what he said. He said, first of all, 3 answers. Number 1, there's no source that prohibits this in the Torah. It's not prohibited. Number 2, dedications are common in Spanish synagogues. So, like, why should he be any different? And number three, this is interesting. The Talmud tells of an inscription in the Holy Temple. There was a guy, he donated like a pitcher full of dinar, and he donated half of it to the temple, and he only kept the half. And like, there was different stories about how this was publicized. You know, that somebody made a big donation to the temple, and apparently it was publicized in the Talmud. But then comes the fifth portion of Jewish law. So just before we do that, I want you to see the answer of the Rashba, and then we'll see the fifth portion of Jewish law. So this is our final case. We're going to close with this on page 212. So Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderes. Do you remember in the first class we spoke about the 9 books that were first printed, the first 9 Jewish books ever printed by the Gutenberg, right after the Gutenberg press? This is one of them. This is Rashba, right? That's how great he is. You asked, Reuven owned a home near the synagogue, which he had built beautifully, and he wanted to connect it to the synagogue to enlarge the sanctuary. However, the community didn't allow this because it would have degraded the value of the existing seats. Instead, they agreed that the extension would house the Torah Ark. That was the deal. And that's what they did, with Reuven sponsoring the entire project. The donor, Reuven, has now come to inscribe his name over the Ark so that he will be remembered for his donation. A few members of the congregation objected. Tell me, do they have the right to stop him or do they not? Anybody in favor of stopping him? Very generous community here, right? This is good. Here's what happened. He comes with the fifth portion of Jewish law. And he says, in the fifth factor, he says, the fifth factor of Jewish law about peer pressure. Peer pressure. Here, you said that? This is what he comes up with. He identifies peer pressure. He realizes that if people are aware that their positive actions will become public knowledge, they will do much, much better a job if they know that somebody's watching. That's what he says. And he points to the biblical heroes. Yeah, look what he says. In text number 8. Here, page 214. Had Reuven, remember the story of Joseph who was thrown into the pit? Right? Joseph was thrown into the pit, and who saved him? Reuven wanted to save him. Reuven negotiated. Instead of killing him, Reuven, the oldest brother, has him just thrown into a pit instead of killed. He wanted to save him, but he kind of slept on the job, and Joseph was sold to Egypt before Reuven came back. But if Reuven knew that he was on camera, you know what would have happened? If Reuven knew that every show in the world for the rest of time would read this story about how he was sleeping on the job, how would he have performed? He would have shown up. He would have made sure that Joseph would never have gone down to Egypt. And that's what it says in the Medrash. Had Reuven known that God would write about him, Reuven heard and saved Joseph from their hand, he would have carried Joseph on his shoulder to his father. Had Aaron known that God would write about him, behold, Aaron is coming out to greet you, he would have gone to greet Moses with tambourines and dancing. Had Boaz, I'm not going to get into all the stories, but had Boaz known that God would write about him, he had handed Ruth roasted grain and she ate and was satisfied and she had some left over, he would have fed her fat calves. In other words, if you knew that you were on candid camera, you'd be performing a lot better. And that is what the Rashba says. He says that if people know that their names are going to be up on the wall, they're going to deliver a much better job. Yes, fellas.
There are people in this shul who are dedicated to it, who provide for there for Gideon, who their holiday, every service, and yet they may not be financially able to give as much as somebody.
Fair enough. You can donate in time, treasure, or talent. And there's not only one way to donate. And you can get a plaque. You could get a plaque for time or for talent. Why not? Why not? We honor people all the time for that. Last year, we had a whole gala. We had a Volunteer of the Year award. We had a Young Families Leadership Award. We of course. Absolutely. Absolutely. We have, yeah, I forget what it's called. Lamplighter or what? I forget what it's called. Yeah, we're always honoring people. Like, why not? And we acknowledge them. We don't just ignore them. I mean, look, obviously, the treasure makes a very big difference, but it's not going to help without the time and the treasure donations as well. In other words, I feel it's very important to have an equal share going around. Do you know what I mean? But why not? How do you know? How do you know? You don't know who's on the permanent plaque. We put plaques up that aren't motivated by treasure. They're motivated by other ways. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, Ron.
Empirical evidence of this is Chicago Federation for 30 years published a book every year with the names of all the donors
In order.
in order and how much they donate.
Huh.
People complain.
So let's look what happened. 1 year they didn't do it.
People complain. So we won't publish the book. That year donations went down significantly.
That's the Rashba. You see, this is 14th century wisdom, folks. And this is actually the reason, this ruling right here is the reason why you will see the plaques in shuls all over the world. This is the reason. Every little prayer book, every little, everything. We every kiddush, we want people to be recognized, because when people realize that they're being recognized, then there's that certain positive peer pressure, which is the 5th section of Jewish law. What?
I want to donate $1,500 to my.
Oh, that's a public appeal. Ooh.
They away, please have patience.
Yeah.
But they will be strong.
Yeah, and on Shul and Yom Kippur. That's right.
Council Committee of the Board of Directors School of the Arts, and one of the most important things is to appreciate and recognize your donors, your workers. That's very important.
Because if you don't, you're shooting yourself in the foot. If nobody knows, then what's the difference? Then why should I give? It is the highest form of giving, but I often say to my donors, I'm asking you to do me a favor and allow us to acknowledge your gift so that other people can be inspired to do the same. People will say, my younger brother donated a Torah. I didn't even cross my mind, but if he could do it, I can do it too. And that's how it works. That's how it works. That's what people do. Let me just finish now, because I don't want to go too much over time. I want to just finish over here by saying that the 5th section of the law is a required skill, not only for rabbis, folks, but for mentors, for parents, for spouses, for teachers, for grandparents, for Jews. Because effective influence requires a relationship-based approach that seriously considers how the message will be received. Empathy is so important. Success comes from tailoring communication and not using a one-size-fits-all solution. By tailoring it to the individual strengths and blind spots to inspire meaningful growth. Imagine you had to actually think about what values to push with your grandchildren and which ones to sei still, keep your mouth shut, right? Imagine if you were conscious and aware of the triggers, the emotional triggers of the people closest to you. Life would actually be a lot more pleasant if you weren't like a bull in a china shop and you weren't just standing on every landmine that was in your area. You were just careful. Imagine if you could learn the language of communication of the people closest to you, because it's not to be taken for granted. For some people, open, honest conversation is best. For others, that's the worst thing you could possibly do to them. Some people need to be schmoozed a little bit. Other people do not want to be patronized. Exactly. Know your customers. Imagine if we knew what strengths we can help them channel and what the ripple effects would be for our actions, from our actions today and for the years ahead. I'd like to just conclude with a summary review video.
Lesson 5. The 5th factor. 1. Rabbinic excellence demands more than mastery of legal texts. It requires a sensitivity to human beings, their needs, vulnerabilities, and inner worlds. 2. The responsa literature reveals that the rabbinic role entails discerning the unspoken emotional reality beneath the question. When this is considered, pre-existing halachic principles might become relevant, reshaping the ultimate ruling. 3. Many responsa reflect an attunement to the precarious realities of a Jewish minority in a hostile exile, offering not only rulings but strategic guidance to safeguard the community from external threats. 4. The responsa often demonstrate the capacity to expose hidden motivations of self-interest, ensuring that halacha is protected from distortion. 5. The responsa literature often reflects a commitment to cultivating communal well-being, such as through the strategic use of public recognition to encourage generosity and civic responsibility. 6. The type of wisdom we studied today is a vital competency for anyone engaged in the sacred work of education, mentorship, or leadership. Transmitting values is not a mechanical transfer of knowledge, but a delicate relationship-based endeavor that requires emotional intelligence, situational awareness, and strategic communication.
So this concludes our lesson today. Our final lesson will not be next week. It's in 2 weeks. So next week is important. But in 2 weeks' time, we're going to take on the future. We've learned so much about the past. We've had a journey through the past 1,000 years, back and forth a few times. But now, next time, we're going to learn about the future. We're going to learn about futuristic rabbinic responsa, questions we are likely to face in the years ahead. So stay tuned for that. God willing, in 2 weeks' time. As always, I welcome your questions and comments. Thank you for joining me here today. And in the meantime, a happy Purim. So how's it codified? Each of these rabbis will write a responsa, which then would typically get published. It gets into a library. Today, the way we do it is we have something called a digital library. So it's in Hebrew, but you can search. So if you want to know if there were any responsa from a certain town somewhere or on a certain topic, you're going to get 4,000 topics. I mean, there's over 600,000 responsa, individual responsa, and those are the ones that survived. They wrote it down at the quill. Yeah. And eventually, that's what I'm saying, 600,000 survived the past millennium. It's amazing. It's amazing that that happened, right? So that's the story, folks. Thank you for joining me here tonight. And I want to wish everybody a wonderful rest of your day.